My name is Dr. Jacob Rorm. I do public programs here at the Historical Society, and it is really my privilege to be able to do this work, to bring to our audiences such great programs on such a wide range of history that we do here. We have great programs coming up here at the History Center. There's a few in your program, but those are not all of them. And we have lots of great programming coming up around our network, especially for holidays. Everything from our holidays at the Hill House, to sleigh rides up at the Forest History Center. And so please check out opportunities to celebrate the end of the year here with us. I also want to just highlight a couple things. One, Norwegian history is something, and Norwegian American history is something that MNHS has been done a lot of wonderful work over the years. Probably no more better place than our press. And if you're not familiar with the wonderful publications that MNHS Press has put out, we have some in our bookstore, and I encourage you to check them out before you head out today. There's wonderful titles. Again, I added a few in the program, but that's just a handful, and I encourage you to keep doing that. I want to think of this program as an opening, as a start. Any program like this, any conversation, cannot begin to cover the breadth and the depth of a history, and so I hope this is a starting point for you, or a continuing point, some sort of a boost along the way, that you continue learning and continue to stay curious. And one of our goals is always that when you come in here, you leave knowing something different or thinking something different about the topic than you did when you came in. And for people who may be very familiar with this topic and have very personal connections to it, I hope it does enlarge and expand your ways of thinking about Norwegian American history. This is also one small contribution to a much larger commemoration that's happening and has been happening all year, called Crossings 200. Which is marking the 200th anniversary of organized Norwegian migration to North America on both sides of the Atlantic. And there's a lot of great events that are happening around the United States and Canada and in Norway for this. And there are some still going on here in the Twin Cities area. So you can go to, I put the email address, not the website address there, to see what else is going on to continue that exploration. And we're really happy to be able to contribute a very small amount to that larger transatlantic commemoration. And you can see the wonderful goals of that program, that commemoration on the front of your program. Really, again, trying to take something and continue to expand and deepen our understanding of it. One other thing I want to mention before we get on, there's a lot of anniversaries, and 2026 is the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, our semi-quincentennial as a nation. We have a lot of great programs that are in the works for that year, and we're going to be kicking off in January with a season of History Forum. If you're not familiar with History Forum, we bring in scholars from around the nation to talk about new scholarship in American history. We have a really great lineup, and it's all going to be focused on the American Revolution and the early United States. Some absolutely wonderful speakers. January kicks off the series with Jeffrey Cohen, the director of the National Constitution Center, and his new book, The Pursuit of Liberty. So, without further ado, let me introduce our speakers today and the wonderful conversation that you're going to be in for a treat here. So we have Dr. Terje Joranger, who is coming here from Norway. He is the director of the Norwegian Emigrant Museum in Ottestad, Norway, and he's a professor of history at the University of Inland Norway in Hamar. He's been very involved in Crossing 200s, both here and in Norway, and he's also an accomplished scholar in this field, and really done really great work to expand our understanding of Norwegian American history and Norwegian migration history. So we're really, really lucky to have him here. And then, of course, in conversation with him is someone who's no stranger to MNHS, Dr. Annette Atkins, who is Professor Emerita at St. John's and Saint Benedict's universities, and has taught history and humanities for many years, been involved in MNHS for many years, including publishing such a wonderful history of our state called Creating Minnesota. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Atkins and Dr. Joranger to the stage.
And it's my pleasure, too, to thank you all for coming. And we have a pretty illustrious crowd out there today. There are lots of Norwegian American Historical Association board members who are there. Including past and present, lots of members and past board members, and Dr. John Christensen, a Emeritus Professor of History from Luther, who I think of as kind of the father, grandfather, Don of American historians of Norway. John and Birgitte, thank you very much for being here. You were welcomed when you came in with music of the Danish String Quartet, and I'm sorry that it was Danish rather than Edvard Grieg, but I think there are 2 members of the Danish String Quartet who are Norwegian. So they can be Scandinavian. One, oh, I'm sorry, Birgitte, thank you. One who's Norwegian. They're integrated, we can be integrated too. So one of the interesting parts about being Norwegian American is how few of us are 100% Norwegian American. Almost all of us have these odd mixtures of Irish, Norwegian, Swedish, Polish, or Hmong, Native American, Norwegian. So we're interested, and we're talking specifically today about Norwegian American, but with the understanding that that's a really a complex, wonderful, complicated category, and there are no firm edges around the outside. And kind of in the spirit of American immigration history, there's a lot of bleeding in and out of that. So much of what we're going to talk about today applies beyond the Norwegians in particular, but it's our pleasure to have Terje here to talk especially about Norwegian. And he's the real star of the show today. I have the pleasure of asking him questions and pushing him, but he's our guy. So we're going to pay attention especially to Terje.
And thank you for letting me be here. I'm very happy to be here.
And I want to start, Terje, by asking you, this is my membership in the Historical Society tag. Start by telling us, please, about yourself as a scholar and as a researcher.
Yes, I've been grappling with migration history, ethnic studies, and I'm also a transnational scholar because I think that migration you need to see that migration is a process. So you need to take into account the sending community, the sending society, and also how it affects the receiving society. So to look at both sides of the Atlantic is important. And in addition, I'm also a local historian because I'm also an author of a local history in Sogn, in Ruster in Sogn, what we call a bygdebok in Norwegian, about the community and farm history. So I have both migration and also the kind of the traditional historical aspects of the field.
And your current work?
My current work, I am director of the Norwegian Emigrant Museum, and the Norwegian Emigrant Museum is an arena where you also can, we also portray the Norwegian immigrant experience, immigrant and immigrant experience.
You have a couple slides of them,
I do.
The museum.
I'll see if here, you see the slide, this is the museum. I know some of you have been there. How many of you have been to the museum? Yes? Some of you have been there. So it's close to Hamar. You see the city of Hamar in the background. And this, we have 8 buildings from the upper Midwest that have been moved from 5 states in the upper Midwest. And they also tell the story about Norwegian immigrants and what they accomplished. So they form an exhibition in itself at the museum. And we also have a large archive and a large library, which we call the Ingrid Semmingsen Library, named after the Norwegian scholar Ingrid Semmingsen, the first Norwegian professor of history, female professor of history. So I think that the museum here, we have different activities there, and I think that in Norway, the new museology, the new museums have acquired a new role these past 30 years, because it's not only an institution where you preserve and take care of objects, but you're an acting institution in society. So we also want to portray migration, both immigration from Norway to the United States, Canada, but also immigration to Norway, in light of what we know about how Norwegians fared when they immigrated and adapted in various connections here. So one thing that we do is that we have a play, a historic play that we had set up for the first time last year, or last summer. It's called 4th of July, 17. Mai. And for Norwegians, I think that's very educational, because for Norwegians, in Norway, they see that they know about emigration. But what happened to those who emigrated? This play is made by a Norwegian American, Nancy Coleman, who lives at Brumunddal, north of Hamar. And this is about Norwegian immigration to the town of Belmont, Iowa. There are historic persons. They came there in 1869. And this is about immigration to America. And then we use the buildings as a background for that. So they are from that time. And then we include how it is. So the title alludes how it is, what kind of identity you acquire over time, from a Norwegian identity to a Norwegian American identity. So I think it's a very educational. And then we also have we cooperate with historical societies in the district around Lake Mjøsa. And now in June we had an event on board of the ship Ratner. It's the oldest Norwegian steamship that is still running from 1856. So there were immigrants, or those who were dressed up as immigrants from each of these communities around Mjøsa, who went aboard the ship Ratner, and they represented the first immigrant from all of these areas. And then we united, and we presented each of the immigrants. Then we went to Eidsvoll where the Constitution was signed, and where we also had a talk about democracy and immigration with the director there and myself. So we reached out to the community. So I think we want to make this a more relevant institution. And this is the exhibition. It's called Ukjent landskap, Unknown Landscape. And that alludes to the new perspectives on Norwegian migration history. So it's about, we include the interactions between Norwegian immigrants and the indigenous population in various parts of Minnesota. We include those who did not fare so well, and those that we never heard of, except for a brochure or for a letter that went back to Norway, but we don't know the fate of the person who wrote it. So we also need those stories. And we also we include a person, her name is Jørgine Boomer, from Lom, and she was a crafter's daughter. A crafter was a person who worked the land but did not own it. He worked for the farmer and had to pay rent. She was from a fairly poor family, and she went to Minnesota. She became a nurse at the Fergus Falls Asylum for the Insane, and then went to New York and met. She had two husbands. Her second husband was Lucius Boomer, who then was the director of Waldorf Astoria, and she became of the hotel, and she became acquainted with royals, with Frank Sinatra, with Polar, the amount. So this was a kind of a what they call klassereise, class journey. And then we also have an interest in portraying immigrants to Norway today, among others Ukrainians. And we have in our exhibit Ukrainians who write letters back home, and they're compared to America letters.
How does working at an immigrant museum that I would say focuses on material culture, how do you think that changes the study of this process over the traditional sources that are primarily paper?
That's a very good question. And I think that the museum is an alternative arena, an additional arena to understand and cope with the Norwegian immigrant experience. So I think it adds some information, or it gives some new aspects of the immigrant experience at the museum, because then you have objects that you can touch and you can see, and then you can compare this information with written source material that we also have. So I think that kind of the mixture there of sources, material and immaterial culture expands our view on migration.
One of the things I loved about the Emigrant Museum when I was there was how viscerally it draws you into the experience. That sometimes reading about the experience gives us a distance from the human lived experience and what those buildings do. Imagining big families living in such small spaces, for example, it makes you wonder about the emotional dynamics that must have occurred within those. So it prompts you to ask questions that may be different from the questions that you get in the paper sources. But and just by the by, what percentage? Do you know what percentage of Norwegians were literate in the 1880s, 1870s?
Who were literate?
Who were literate?
I don't know the percentage, but I know that a recent study has shown that Norwegians were more literate than most European people in most European countries, and they had a knowledge about, for instance, about information channels to America. There was a knowledge about that. So we know that Norway was not among the poorer or countries that were mostly literate in Europe, and that's a myth, I think, that has been created. Yeah.
But so Norwegians in Norway would have known about the American experience, of course, through Norwegian Americans, but they would also have had access to the larger world of press coverage, wouldn't they?
Yes, and then you talk about class in Norway. The higher classes in Norway, the middle class and the higher classes had access to newspapers and the general farmer and the did not have access to the newspapers as such. But what's interesting is that new research has shown that several Christiania or Oslo newspapers in the 1830s and 1840s printed letters from immigrant farmers who did not have the same access if they had lived in Norway, but they sent letters from Illinois, Wisconsin, back to Christiania. So they got kind of an arena there to present their views. So that was a kind of a democratic immigration.
So lots of people in this place already know a lot about Norwegian immigration through our own families, if not through the scholarship. So based on your own research, what are the three most important things that you think we need to know about Norwegian migration?
There are several understudied elements of Norwegian American studies. I am trying to find out.
You used to have a clicker for the slides.
Yeah.
It's right there in your lap.
There it is.
Yeah.
This is one element is the to understand to include the indigenous populations in the Norwegian immigrant experience. This is a map that shows the reservations after the passing of the Dawes Act in 1887, or the Severalty Act that stated that you could sell that indigenous population in the reservations, the surplus land could be sold to settlers. So that means that Norwegian immigrants could then come and settle very close to in the reservation areas. So I'm focusing on the Lake Traverse reservation. I can get back to that, but the interactions with indigenous is important. Another aspect that is also important is to show that immigration also had repercussions and influenced local communities on both sides of the Atlantic. And I think that has been understudied. And then you get into the transnational history. Mm-hmm. That immigration was to a large extent translocal, that people from a certain area would go to a certain area and settle, because Norwegian immigration was to a large extent very regional. But then these immigrants, many of them would send money back. They would return back to Norway, perhaps to get a spouse, and then return back home again to Minnesota, for instance. And they would send money, and then so Norwegian local communities and American local communities had these strong ties across the Atlantic. I think it's worthwhile to look at those as well. And a third theme, I think, is to understand more of the immigration that takes place in Norway, at least in Norway today, in light of what we know about Norwegian immigration here. There are so many similarities in the process. I mean, there are different times, but there are different geographical area. But I think that there are some similarities there that are very educational.
So a couple questions related to what you're saying. What were the main factors that pushed Norwegians out of Norway?
Immigration it's kind of complex because we cannot necessarily point to just one, but I think that there is a number of causal factors that may cause immigration. In Norway experienced a very high population growth in the first part of the 19th century, and in various districts, the population grew by between 80 and 100% in 40 or 50 years. So there became an overpopulation. And when news of America became known, that was a great interest for the surplus population to go. But we can also, we have, of course, the odels at Ottestad, the right of the oldest son to take over the farm, undivided, is also a factor, because then you have, all your siblings had to find alternatives, how to make a living, because one stayed with the farm. But I also use the Norwegian constitution as a kind of a basis to explain immigration. For instance, in the second paragraph of the Norwegian constitution from 1814, when Norway acquired its independence, it states that the evangelical Lutheran Church is the only church that's a state church of Norway, and all grown-ups have to present that religion to their children. And that religion, you also have to be a Norwegian Lutheran to have positions in Norway. And it also said that Jews are not accepted in Norway, and that Jesuits and monastic orders are exempt from staying. So it was a very liberal constitution in one way, but also a very authoritarian constitution. So I think that it points directly to the immigration of 1825, when you have one Quaker, and also several Haukean sympathizers who were on the margins, very marginalized in the Norwegian Evangelical Lutheran Church. So that if you compare the Norwegian Constitution with that paragraph, and compare that to the First Amendment of the American Constitution, which then sees the separation of church and state, then America becomes this magnet for those who are dissatisfied with the Norwegian Evangelical Lutheran Church. Another paragraph is paragraph 50 in the Norwegian Constitution, the right to vote. And the right to vote in 1814 was given to men, but those who were landed, or who rented land that was taxable, or if you had a certain fortune or had some public position. For those who did not own land, and for younger siblings of farmers in Norway, the land acts in America, with the Preemption Act, the Homestead Act, and also the Dawes Act later, was a very important magnet. So if you were a crafter, for instance, the person who did not own your own land, then because you worked for a farmer, if you went to America, you could acquire land quite fast, and you also got the right to vote. And in many instances, men who came here got the right to vote several decades before they had the chance to do that in Norway. So I think that immigration in that way is also a democratic migration.
I'm interested in the role of the churches and of religion in this process. It's a factor that many contemporary historians don't think enough about, I think, in the 19th century, where religion occupied a much bigger place in more people's lives and in the culture than it seems to now. So 1830s, 1840s in the US was this sort of burned over era. There was so much religious revivalism. What's happening in Norwegian churches in the early years of Norwegian emigration that might contribute to the pushing out?
In Norway, you mean?
In Norway.
I think that the pastors in the Norwegian church in Norway admonished or were very critical to immigration. But then in Norway too, you had this a revival and some more liberal theology that came in. But of course, the first Norwegian trained pastors in America, they came from these Norwegian universities that had this very strict view on immigration. And I know Pastor Didriksen, who visited Norwegians in Karskanang in the 1840s, was terrified with seeing Mormons, Norwegian Baptists, Norwegian Methodists, because they were not part of the fold, the Lutheran fold. But I think that the Church of Norway changed as well. So and then you got the Augsburg here, also became more the free church, and you got that also had Norwegian pastors, a pastorate that came there. So I think that there was a change in Norway, and in America, you had the free church system, so that anyone could create a congregation. Mm-hmm. So you see a splintering of various parallel synods coexisting as a part of that.
But so would my ancestors have likely come from a more conservative end or a more liberal end of the Norwegian church? Mm. One or the other? Both?
Oh, in Norway, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you had this I mentioned the Haugians. They were accepted, an accepted part of the Lutheran state church, but they were very inspired by lay preaching and did not adhere to the more formal teachings of the church. So they found this Hauge synod here that also splintered off, but they found a kind of a safe haven here. Mm-hmm. So in Norway, and the Haugians in Norway were a very strong force in Norwegian society in the 1830s and 1840s. And that is also understudied, what kind of their impact in Norway and also their impact here. Mm-hmm. But I think that they were kind of the more conservative ones. And then you had, of course, in here a kind of a division with the slavery debate and the different debates in the second part of the 19th century that created more other churches.
So how did emigration from Norway change Norway?
First of all, it resulted in a population decrease.
Population decrease.
Mm-hmm. Population decrease. In the Gudbrandsdal Valley, for instance, the population decreased by 20% between 1865 and 1891. So that's a large decrease, and that took place in many places. That took place in many local communities. So no local community was left unchanged in a way by immigration. Immigration kind of was prevalent in practically all local communities in Norway and in all the cities. So population decrease is one factor, and then if I can find my button, this is also another. You see to the left, you see some ruins. These are some ruins from a craft in Valdres. So several in Norwegian rural communities, immigration also affected the farms, and the farms that were located in the margin, crafts, but also small farms, small cell phoning units. The buildings were left empty when the family emigrated. So the ruins you see to the left there, the family went to Årdal Township in Ottestad County in the 1870s. No one ever came to replace them. So the landscapes changed, and then also that meant that the agricultural units became larger, because and then the farms became larger because they could use these units that were left idle. But then also you see the photo to the right there. That's from Wisconsin. It could have been in Minnesota. But this is how also Norwegian immigrants and other immigrants make an impact on the landscape. This is the Blue Mounds area. You see the Blue Mounds in the background. That's a sacred place for the Ho-Chunk. And when Norwegians came there, predominantly Norwegians in the 1840s, they changed the landscape entirely with very intensive agriculture, and the old prairie disappeared and so on. And that takes place in many, that is also an example of how immigration also affects local areas in America, local communities in America, landscapes.
So if 20% of people left from particular villages, do they come back in size and population? But then my second question is, yes, was it the case that Norwegians in America were sending money back to Norway? And if so, what effect did that infusion of new money have on those sending towns?
Yeah, the population in Norway grew very fast in spite of the immigration. So by around 1800, the population was about 900,000 in Norway. By 100 years later, it was almost 2 million. So there was an increase, and those who stayed had more space for a while. But then also you see as a tendency in Norway from the mid 20th century for people leaving the rural areas to go into the cities. So then you have more space again in the rural areas. But
do you have one more there?
Yeah,
there.
This is so. Those who emigrated here, many of them sent remittances back to Norway. Some also returned. Some also returned to stay especially after 1880, when transportation became more accessible. But you also have many also sent remittances that helped to establish churches in Norway, to establish institutions, to build a farm, to reduce debt in families. So in 1905, according to statistics, remittances sent from Norwegian Americans to Norway made up 20% of the Norwegian state budget. The state budget was 100 million, so about 20 million kroner. And in Agder, the southern counties of Agder, Norway, the income from Norwegian remittances in the 1890s made up more than the total tax money that was collected in Agder at the time. So these were huge amounts. And to the church to the left here is called Hensåsen. That was built in 1902, and the money came predominantly from Norwegian Americans here who had their roots in that area. And also I also included two Vang churches. There's a Vang church, Lutheran church in Goodyear County to the right.
Where is that?
That's in Goodyear County, by Denison, Minnesota. And the church to the left is the Vang church in Norway. So the replication of place names is also an interesting part of migration. You see many Norwegian place names in Minnesota.
And then if we could go sort of to the larger question, how does the removal of that many people from a culture change the culture, not the economy, but the culture? And then what does it do to Norway to have so much American connection to Norway?
I think that for a long time it's difficult to understand, but I think that Norwegians and Norwegian Americans were living in a common sphere that and they had Norwegian American newspapers were a very important bridge between the two cultures, two countries. And so my own great-great-grandparents could sit and read the Koraposten that their son in North Dakota had given them. They lived in Norway. They could read it in Norwegian. And theoretically, they could read about neighbors who lived here. So there was a Norwegian-American world. And I think that this greater Norway that Darren Olsen, is another scholar, is writing about is a very interesting aspect of this. That I think that Norway, through immigration, was very connected to America, and that these ties have remained very strong. And Crossings 200 in Norway, you know, we have a parallel here in the US. One of the goals is to create and strengthen the ties between Norway and Norwegians and descendants of Norwegians who came here, because we're based on a common shared cultural heritage, because we do have many common bonds here. Are there many of you who are in touch with people or relatives in Norway? Yes, some of you. And in Norway, I asked the same. I asked if they know if they have immigrants in their family to America, and there are a lot of hands in the air. And I also asked, how many of you are still in touch with their relatives? Then there are quite a few fewer, but there always are people who raise their hands. Mm-hmm. So I think that person-to-person, this personal contact is still there. It's weaker, but I think that has been upheld for a long time. And I think that it has created an understanding of knowing where you're from here. Perhaps you know the parish or the community you're from. And among Norwegians, I think that there is an increased interest in Norway now, I know, to get in touch with their relatives. And I think that is something that, although it's weakening, I think the Crossings 200 may be a new way to create an awareness about these strong ties.
I know from knowing your work, Terje, that part of what you're doing is trying to disrupt what have become dominant narratives about the Norwegian immigration experience and the Norwegian migration experience. What's the value of disrupting that story?
I think it's important to look at new perspectives, and I think that new generations of historians create new questions, so that you ask new questions that perhaps if they have not been asked earlier, I think that's good. And I think that it's not to do away with what has been produced earlier, but it's to look at new angles and how you can explain the migration experience. For instance, I just wrote an article about nation building in Norway and in the United States, and that land legislation in conjunction with with nation building. Land legislation that affected the indigenous population here, but also the indigenous population in Norway, the Sami, who also were a part of, like here, there was a racial hierarchy where the indigenous population was very on the bottom. Norwegians were a preferred immigrant group here. And in Norway, the Sami and other national minorities, in addition to the Sami, were also on the bottom of a racial ladder. And so I think it's a larger question, who belong and who do not belong to this nation? Who is the in-group, who is the out-group? So I think there are some similarities, and I think that's very fruitful, similarities between nations and processes that are similar.
Yeah, I've had students ask, does history change? And my standard answer these days has been, history doesn't change, but the historians change. And because we're shaped by different times, we ask different questions. So part of what you're looking at especially is what have we been blind to in our telling of the story? And I think your current research is right in the middle of that question.
Yes.
So what have we been blind to?
I think that we dare to raise new questions. I've also been writing about whiteness, about the white privilege of Norwegians, which is an established field here, but which is has recently become a field in the Scandinavian countries. Excuse me. But I think that whiteness is also a way to portray that is not the same as ethnicity, but whiteness is a set of privileges or characteristics that gives one group, that makes one group a preferred group as compared to other groups. So I think that you can see some aspect of society that has been hidden or that you don't find because you haven't posed that question. So I think it's the new question that history doesn't change, but then you can ask new questions. I think that's fruitful.
What would you say well, say a little bit more about whiteness. That's a word that scholars are using these days. Yeah. And there's some disparagement of that term outside of the scholarly community especially. But what is the term and what's the probative, analytic usefulness of a term like whiteness?
I think that it gives a hint of that some groups have been more accepted than others by the government or by authorities, especially in more complex or more multicultural settings, and I think that it's valuable in order to see what kind of power that some groups have and who are accepted by the authorities in as said country or nation, and then it can work as a mirror to see those groups that do not have those privileges, and then you can ask new question: why are these groups privileged, and why are these other groups not privileged? So I think for Norwegians, they were accepted and privileged here because they were white, because they were Protestant, because the Anglo-American elite was Protestant, and also that they were of the so-called Nordic race. So they had some characteristics with them that placed them in a favorable position in that racial hierarchy. And you see that with the legislation in the 1940s, for instance, that was very racist, that kind of wanted to reduce the Southern and Eastern European groups. And you also have a history here of Asian groups being banned, like the Chinese Exclusion Act and so on. So Norwegian, I think that the fact that Norwegians have been accepted as a privileged group also made them more easier for Norwegian, in a way, to acquire goods and to buy land. They had a chance to go into politics. They didn't meet hindrances on their way. And I think that also may have paved the way for them to enter into the American middle class faster than other groups because of their privilege.
Though it's interesting, as one of the complexities, that this research sort of turns on its head at least a story that I understood when I was earlier of Norwegians being discriminated against and Norwegians being outsiders and Norwegians being made fun of in school. So it's like the traditional story has Norwegians somehow as victims, and the whiteness stories turn that on its head. And so what's interesting and complicated is how do those two things exist at the same time? And how do those two things interact? I think we're coming closer to the end of our time, and then you get to have your time. So we'll be interested in having your questions. But my biggest last question is, why does any of this matter at all? And it's a question I think that's really worth taking seriously. It's a sort of so what question. So what?
Yeah. I think that we are, it's important to work on, I think, migration because it's meaningful, because it has to do with people, and it has to do with relations, and it has to do with who we are, where do we come from, and also I have always been very fascinated by those who emigrated. My interest started because I went in these local history books and it says this person emigrated to America, nothing more. What happened to those? And that's what kind of spurred my interest in finding out what happened to them. So I bought a car and traveled across the Midwest to relocate the settlements that people from a certain area had. And that was very meaningful because they didn't disappear. They re-established communities and a new life. And we see today also this, because Norwegian immigration was also this contact was also a type of globalization. It kind of made the world smaller. But I think that migration is timeless. And I think that there are so many rewards from this study of Norwegian immigration here. And we are lucky because 200 years of immigration, we have historical sources for that time period. So we are lucky, so we can document much of that. And I think that can be helpful to understand some of the other migration processes that are going on. And not the least that people here in Norway know that, well, we were divided through immigration, but we're family. I think that's important.
It seems to me that in the U.S., you can't be right now without seeing the weight of immigration issues in our lives and in our public life and in our civic life. And it seems to me in Norway, that it's also a complicated subject right now. So it seems to me especially important that we get some of these things right. One of the things I wanted to pick up on earlier was the stories of Norwegians who came here and failed, or came here and then decided to go back home. And with that, I'm going to let you answer that, and then Jacob is down here to tell us it's time for questions.
Yes. Yeah, those who failed and the stories that we never heard. That is also been. So what kind of stories have been told and which stories have not been told? So I think that's an interesting angle. So those who did not succeed, those who did not follow the general traditional immigrant story. In Norway, as we talk about the rich uncle in America, for instance, those voices, also the indigenous voices, that did not, they have been silent. And so we need to, that's also part of the story. How can we also present those who didn't succeed? That's also a part of the kind of complex story of migration.
So I think America has needed stories of success. And so our immigrant stories have tended to be stories of success when we all know that it's more complicated. So anyway, we're going to pause in our part. Thank you for paying this close attention. Thank you, Terje. And
if you have a question, raise your hand and I'll bring the mic to you so we can make sure we all hear that. And yeah, we have some time for some Q&A. So,
and again, if we could turn the house lights up, we can see you better.
Yeah. And we tried to get the screen darker or the screen brighter for you. We're having some issues with both our lighting and our sound today, so thank you for bearing with us.
Yeah, I was just wondering if either one of you happen to know what particular areas in Minnesota have historically had the most, heavy concentration of Norwegian immigrants coming here. What parts of Minnesota were heavy Norwegian areas?
Southeastern Minnesota was heavily with Goodhue, Fillmore, Freeborn counties. Also farther west central Minnesota, with the Pope County, Minnesota River, and also the whole Red River Valley, stretching north. So there is less in the northeastern corner as far as I know, but especially in the southeastern corner and westwards, west central and northwestern Minnesota was heavily Norwegian and Swedish.
Did you say not much in the Northeast, which is very interesting to me? Do you have Norwegian ancestors?
I do.
And where did they settle?
Well, my grandmother settled up across the border from Roseau, Minnesota. So she was up in the
Up in that
far
Red River Valley,
northeastern.
yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
I have many Norwegian relatives that came from Yellow Medicine County, and it was Miland, Madison, that area. And they still have a pretty strong brogue in that area.
You can still hear the Norwegian in their voice?
Is it Madison?
Well, I know there are virtually no Norwegians in Stearns County. Right. But if you go to Pope County, which is quite nearby, a lot of Norwegians. They're very interesting ethnic concentrations.
Isn't Madison the lutefisk capital of the world? Self-proclaimed, probably, but that says something. Other questions?
That's why we make him do the running. We do the sitting.
What about you mentioned a little bit of the Sami people. Can you talk a little bit more of them? And then how would anybody even know if they were descended from the Sami people, because their history's kind of been erased?
Yes, thank you for asking that question. There's been little research on Sami immigration. We know about the Manitoba expedition in 1898 when many Sami with hundreds of reindeer were sent to Yukon, to Alaska, to help Inuits. Because they had trouble to survive, but they needed. There were herders from Norway who came with. So there are some descendants of that expedition in Seattle, but Polsbo, close to Seattle. But we also know that the studies that exist, according to those studies, the Sami were discriminated against in Norway. So many of them chose not to immigrate as Sami. So they might have been registered as Norwegian. So there is some under-communication and some holes there. But what we know is that they went, they identified as Norwegian, and we know about some of them went to Minnesota. So I think that I really hope that this could also develop so that we know more about the Sami immigration as well. And of course in Norway the Sami were forced to become Norwegianized very strongly. So from the mid 1800s, so they also had this feeling of inferiority.
I have kind of a challenging question to ask, and I think hopefully you'll both be able to answer it. But as Americans, of course, we all descend from all parts of the world, and I think it's a yearning for us as Americans to sort of feel connected to our ancestors' roots, and whether we have, as you say, not many of us have full Norwegian heritage or any other part of the world, and we're kind of a blend, but we still want to connect to those parts of the world. I guess I wonder, and this goes off of that Sami connection too, if Norwegians are not considered indigenous to Norway, where can we as descendants of ethnic Norwegians here in America feel connected to our indigenous roots? Like, what part of the planet are we indigenous, is what I'm wondering.
So could you repeat the last question?
Well, and I'm interested if you have an answer to that. Yep.
Oh, I'm just wondering if ethnic Norwegians, because as Americans, we come from all over the world, right? Asia and Africa, and hopefully not really Antarctica, I don't think, but most of us come from other parts of the world, and then of course we honor our brothers and sisters who do descend from this land, right? And they're indigenous people here that are the real Americans, which of course is a borrowed name from another foreign country, Amerigo Vespucci, right? So we won't even go there, but my question is, where can people who descend as Norwegian Americans or as ethnic Norwegians in the land that is currently called Norway today, where can those ethnic Norwegians claim indigenous heritage? And I don't know the answer. I'm just wondering with the terminology.
In Norway, the Norwegian Parliament is old, but then we have the Sami Parliament that was established in around 1990, and to be able to vote, for the representatives there, you have to know that you're at least 1/8 or 1/16 Sami. So there are some people who want to find their identity. They go to is it Family Search or someone who has you can take a test, a blood test, to see if you're
Ancestry.
To check that. But there is so much that has not this forced Norwegianization that lasted until the 1970s has been very strong. So there is so much silence surrounding this topic. But I know that the ancestry, that's the one way to prove that if you're indigenous.
And I think yours is a really interesting question, and I hope you go into history, and I hope you help us figure that out. Because I don't know anybody really asking that question right now, though. John, do you want to speak to this? Please, John Christensen.
We use the word indigenous to refer to a particular kind of culture. And what you're saying is, what about the Norwegians who are not Sami? Where are they indigenous? Well, all Norwegians, whether they're Sami or not, have been, those who are of native Norwegian communities have been living there for thousands of years. And so all Norwegians in that sense are indigenous, but the Sami have a particular lifestyle that puts them into a separate category that would give them an indigenous lifestyle. But basically all Norwegians in the year 1800 had lived there for thousands of years. Your ancestors, my ancestors, the rest of our ancestors. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, and now I understand. Yeah, I didn't catch the question correctly, but that's correct. And I think that what we term indigenous are those who were living, those groups that were living in Norway at the time when the boundaries were created, when Norway became a nation. And you're right that both ethnic Norwegians and the Sami were living there at the time.
Well, and embedded in that question...
In a longer time span, of course, all human beings are wanderers. Yeah. We've all wandered around the world. And live in many parts of the world. And this is true of all human beings, all human societies.
And it touches on the sort of deeper human question of where do I belong? And where do I fit? And where am I at home? Which is a wonderful, complicated question. And who gets to claim to be home in a place and who doesn't?
It seems that every group that's come from somewhere else to this country has had their terrible moment of being the other. Was there pushback to the Norwegian a couple of years, 200 years, at any respect?
Pushbacks in here, you mean?
Pushback in the United States, or even in this part of the country. Were they accepted well, or were there some moments when that was the other and wasn't really looked at as favorably?
That's also a good question. Yes, because this is a kind of, it's not linear, it's very complex. And we have instances where Norwegians were regarded as the other and were looked down upon as newcomers. For instance, I know about an instance in Mower County, Minnesota, where a Norwegian ran for the position of Justice of the Peace in the 1860s, and I think he won, and there was an American who lost, and he became furious, and he talked about losing to this foreigner of some kind. And I also seen the same in Wisconsin, of those original Americans who came from the East originally, who were the founders of the communities. A family came back many years later because they had moved south in America and came back to see the communities and see that we didn't know that these newcomers would make it. So there are some instances of that. But like in Seattle, for instance, there are studies about Norwegians there who were hyper white and who then even looked down on the Americans. That was around 1905 within the Norwegian independence. So it's complex. So there are so many angles to this. But thank you for asking.
Yeah, that looking down on Americans is a specialty of German immigrants, especially I'm saying especially in Minnesota because that's what I know. But the number of German immigrants who came who had no interest in becoming American, right? They came to have land, they came to get ahead, but were they going to trade in the legacy of German culture in the mid-19th century for American culture? What's American culture in 19th century America? So I'm going to turn away from Goethe and Faust and sort of the great musicians, and for what? And so there is this really interesting superiority that some immigrants bring with them. And then it's counterbalanced, this sort of mythology of the dumb Norwegian, or the dumb immigrant being those people who aren't yet speaking English, but getting labeled and categorized. So that's what I love about studying immigration history, is that it's all this stuff all at the same time, all mixed up together.
For scholars in Norway, has there been any interest in writing about those Norwegians who returned as failures? They became addicted to alcohol, et cetera, when they returned? Any writing about that?
Yes, a master's degree that was presented at the University of Southeastern Norway this spring wrote about the return immigrants, especially from 2 counties, and what they brought with them and why they return. What did they bring with them from their stay here? And I think, but I think that's also an interesting subject that I think will get more attention in the future, because that is also. There was a study in 1990 conducted by Knut Djupedal, the former director of the Emigrant Museum, and Dorothy Burton Skårdal at the University of Oslo. And they had this large national project on return immigrants. Immigrants who came back between 1930 and after the war. And some of them were ridiculized by Norwegians because they had experienced things here that the Norwegians didn't want to believe. So that is one thing, too. But then they also brought a new worldview back to Norway because they had seen a larger part of the world, and also brought back some know-how, how to efficiency in terms of work life and so on. So there are some aspects there. So immigration also contributed, in a way, back to Norway, to Norwegian society by those who returned.
One of the questions we didn't have time to get to is about Norwegian American culture and what that means, which gives me an opportunity to tell a story that I've been dying to tell. And then I think, Jacob, we're pretty close to the time, aren't we? About disagreement that my husband and I used to have. When I said Christmas, I meant December 24th. When he said Christmas, he meant December 25th. Right? He's Irish, I'm Norwegian. It didn't occur to me to think, I didn't think of that as a thing until I met this other thing. where he's absolutely certain that that's Christmas, and I say, that's Christmas. It's interesting to me the ways that the culture has kind of bled into our lives in ways that we don't even notice until we meet a different outsider at a different time. So, Jacob, over to you.
Thank you so much. There are more time for questions. We have some time if you do want to, I'll say, both Annette and Terje would be happy to talk a little bit more. But thank you so much for coming. Please check out other events we have coming up. Please check out other events in the Crossings 200 commemoration throughout the rest of this year. And please join me in just thanking our guests once again.
No, and thanking you.